Shalom, I'm Moshe Margolin, one of the co-chairs, along with Freddie Perlmutter, of the Adult Education Committee of the Jewish Center in Princeton, New Jersey. On behalf of the committee, I welcome you to this program entitled The Challenges of Translating the Bible with world-famous scholar, Professor Robert Alter. Tonight's program is especially meaningful for me. Professor Alter was originally set to speak to us in Princeton in November 2019. The program was then rescheduled for March 26, 2020. We all know what happened to cause another postponement. We have finally arrived. I want to take this opportunity to thank the following Adult Education Committee members for helping with tonight's program. Frank Lees is our Zoom master. Lynn Cooper-Smith will be introducing Professor Alter. Neil Litt will be handling the Q&A, and Freddie Perlmutter will be doing the acknowledgements and announcements. Lynn, take it away.
It is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Robert Alter is professor of the Graduate School and emeritus professor of Hebrew and Comparative Literature at the University of California, Berkeley. Professor Alter received his master's degree and doctorate from Harvard University. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, the Council of Scholars of the Library of Congress, and a past president of the Association of Literary Scholars and Critics. Professor Alter's 24 published books, which have been translated into 10 languages, include 2 prize-winning volumes on biblical narrative and poetry. One of his publications, The Hebrew Bible, a translation with commentary, is a 3-volume, 3,000-page work that represents the culmination of nearly 2.5 decades of work. Recipient of the 2019 Arts and Letters Award in Literature from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the Robert Kirsch Award for Lifetime Contribution to American Letters, among many, many others. Professor Alter lives in Berkeley, California, but tonight we welcome him virtually to address us in Princeton, New Jersey. Professor Robert Alter, welcome.
Thank you for your kind introduction. I should say, by the way, that I think it was 1992-93, my wife and I spent a visiting year at Princeton, and we were members of the Jewish Center here. Anyway, the obvious question one would pose to anyone who has translated the Hebrew Bible is, why do we need another translation? That is, we have a canonical translation in English, the King James Version, and then there is a variety of up-to-date translations that were done in the second half of the 20th century by impressive scholarly committees, Jewish, Protestant, and Catholic, and the Jewish Publication Society translation is one that is widely used in synagogues and followed by Jews. Now, obviously, if you set out to do a translation when many translations exist, you have to have some dissatisfaction with what is out there. So I will say, I don't want to really talk in detail about the King James Version. There are many beautiful things in it. It certainly is superior in many respects to those translations that were done, whatever, 40, 50, 60 years ago. And it also has drawbacks. Obviously, the one that's not its fault, that the language is now archaic and there are terms that we don't use anymore or that have changed in meaning. There are also many errors, some of them minor, some of them real howlers, because the knowledge of biblical Hebrew on the part of Christian Hebraists in the early 17th century was not what we have now. Finally, there is a Christian bias in the King James Version. Some of it is unconscious, I think, and some of it is quite deliberate. So on all those grounds, there are difficulties with the King James Version. When I first became involved in studying the Bible, writing about the Bible, which was a long time ago, back in the 1970s, I thought, well, the JPS translation has to be authoritative. These scholars have impressive credentials. I actually knew a couple of them personally. And in the ad hoc translations that I did for my book on biblical narrative, I more or less followed the general precedent of the JPS. As time passed, I realized this was a grave mistake, that these translations, not only the JPS, but the ones done by other scholarly religious committees, were disastrous. So why are they disastrous? I would say there are two general flaws: a deficient sense of literary English, and then a deficient sense of literary Hebrew. The second may shock you a little bit, but the literary shaping of narrative prose in the Bible and the finely wrought articulation of the Hebrew of the poetry are nothing you would study in doing a PhD in biblical studies. So these men, I think they were all men at the time, who had PhDs from Harvard and Yale and the Divinity School at the University of Chicago and so forth, or in England, the Protestant translations, of course, Oxford and Cambridge. In their doctoral studies, learned many useful things, but they never learned anything about style in the Bible, for example, which is, I find, a shocking omission. Now, accompanying this deficient sense of Hebrew style is a deficient sense of English style. That is, it may have to do with a specialization of knowledge, but these committees really exhibit a tin ear for English. They make mistakes in idiom, they mingle different kinds of diction from sentences that sound like the daily newspaper to sentences that sound like bureaucratic directives and so forth. So the result is a set of translations that are wretched to read. Now, why is it so important to try to represent, to the best of one's ability, the literary shaping of the Hebrew? One might say, well, these are not literary texts, these are religious texts. And that's a false dichotomy. That is, for reasons which we can't explain, these Hebrew writers, who certainly were setting about to convey a new vision of the monotheistic faith, of the nature of God and humankind, of the covenant between God and Israel, and so on and so forth. These writers chose to cast their religious vision in finely wrought prose and often beautiful poetry. And if you don't get the literary shaping of the language, you're missing a lot of what is actually going on. So that is what motivated me. Okay, so very briefly, there are three levels of diction perceptible in the Bible, and a translation has to honor all three. There's the narrative prose, which is, I would call it a kind of middle diction. That is, it's homespun, very direct. It uses a deliberately limited vocabulary. And through this, it is quite eloquent. Then there is the language of the poems, which, as far as one can make out, reflects an older stratum of ancient Hebrew and is a specialized poetic diction. And you have to do something with that as well. And then in between those two is the language of the dialogue, which I suppose one could say it's by and large correct literary Hebrew, but it makes all kinds of gestures in the direction of the spoken language, which of course we have no remnant of. Now, let me give you first an illustration of what I've called this simple homespun eloquence. This is the beginning of the flood story. And it happened after 7 days that the waters of the flood were over the earth. Notice the choice of the verb, were over the earth. The moderns don't like that. So they have to surge, overwhelmed, whatever. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day, and then we have a one-line poem. And the poem, there are often these little poetic insets in biblical narrative. All the well springs of the great deep burst, and the casements of the heavens were open. Well, why casements? The Hebrew is arubot, which does mean windows. I found it piquant many years ago when I first studied Rashi, that he took this unusual word arubot, and he said, Bela'az, that is in the foreign language, that is Old French, which was spoken around him, this is fenestre, or fenêtre in modern French. So to translate it as windows is accurate. The JPS, I think, says something like sluice gates, which is a crime, because what they've done is substitute their own metaphor for the metaphor in the Hebrew. But why did I translate it as casements? This has to do with levels of diction. There is one word that appears many dozens of times in the Bible that means window, and that's chalon. It's also the word for window in modern Hebrew. But this is a word that appears maybe 8 or 9 times in the biblical corpus. And in all but one case, it appears in poetry. So my inference is that it's poetic diction. And there's certain reasons for thinking that it's a somewhat archaic term. So I thought I would try to represent this, not with the ordinary word window, but with the word casements, which is something you'll find in the poetry of Keats, you'll find it in Shakespeare. So it has a certain antique coloration, which I think is just right for the Hebrew. Now, let me go on just a bit here. And the rain was over the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Again, that simple primary verb was over the earth. To me, that's something eloquent. And you shouldn't substitute something like pounded down or pelted the earth or whatever. That very day, Noah and Shem and Ham and Japheth, the sons of Noah, and Noah's wife and the three wives of his sons together with him came into the ark. They, as well as beasts of each kind, and cattle of each kind, and each kind of crawling thing that crawls on the earth, and each kind of bird, each winged thing. They came to Noah into the ark, 2 by 2 of all flesh that has the breath of life in it, within it. And those that came in, male and female of all flesh, they came as God had commanded him, and the Lord shut him in. And the flood was 40 days over the earth, and the water multiplied and bore the ark upward, and it rose above the earth. And the waters surged and multiplied mightily over the earth. And the ark went on the surface of the water. Okay, that's quite enough a flood for us. I use multiplied because I think the writer is playing on the fact that in the creation story, humankind is enjoined to be fruitful and multiply. And here it's the waters that are destroying almost all humankind that are multiplying. But what is the ark doing? The ark went on the surface of the water. Well, the moderns say, that's not right. We don't talk about ships going on the water. So they say it floated, it sailed, all kinds of things which I think are not hinted. It floated, did it not have a rudder? So it's messing with the Hebrew. Okay, let me pick up a few things that I tried to replicate in my translation. One is the expressive use of repetition. And there are all kinds of different examples, and I don't think that I'll have time to show you all the examples. I would like to. But let me take one small instance from a story you're all very familiar with, the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. The narrator first says, in my translation, when they get to the mountain, and Abraham said to his lads, let me and the lad go up and worship, and after we will return to you. Now, as far as I know, no existing translation repeated lad like that. Abraham said to his lads, let me and the lad. What is a lad? The Hebrew is na'ar, and a na'ar is a young male person, or by extension, anyone in a position of subservience. So it could mean servant, and everybody translates it as servant. But by doing that, they miss a wrenching point of the repetition. Abraham says to his lads, who are his servants, maybe even his slaves, let me and the lad go up and worship. And now that very same word is being used by a father as a term of affection to his son whom he thinks he's about to sacrifice on the altar. So it's a very small point with one word, but you see how significant it is to retain the repetition. Okay, then there's a matter of rhythm. Now, everybody knows that poetry is supposed to be rhythmic, and the modern translators reach to do that in their English versions. I think they do a very imperfect job. But what they're not aware of is that good literary prose is also rhythmic, and it's meaningful in its rhythms. And so let me give you one small example from the creation story in chapter 1 of Genesis. The narration is reporting the creation of the heavenly luminaries. And God created, in my version, the great light for dominion of day and the small light for dominion of night and the stars. Now, as a little aside, I talked about the moderns having a tin ear for English. The JPS translation renders this the larger light to dominate the day and the smaller light to dominate the night. Now, that is an offense against the English language. Why? Because the verb to dominate it belongs in a sentence like, after the Second World War, the Soviet Union dominated the smaller states of Eastern Europe. It's not what the sun does to the day or the moon does to the night. But it does, the dominate does something else, which is an error. It wrecks the rhythm. Now, the rhythm sounds like this in the Hebrew. Et ha'ma'or hagadol lememshelet hayom, v'et ha'ma'or hakaton lememshelet halayla, v'et hakochavim. I hope you all heard that beautiful cadence. And at first, I wasn't quite sure why I chose dominion. All the other translations, it says like to rule over or to govern. And then I realized it was the cadence, that is, the great light to dominion of day, for dominion of day, replicates Ha'ma'or Hagadol Lememshelet Hayom, and the same for the moon afterwards in the verse. So as you hear me say this, you might think, well, that's a kind of fussy, maybe peripheral thing that professors of literature like to fool around with. But why is it important? Okay, I think all great literary texts, rhythm has some kind of meaning. Often it's just subliminal, as those wonderful iambic cadences in Moby Dick that almost scan like blank verse are a way of Melville's lining up his epic novel with Milton and with Shakespeare. So what's going on here? This is the priestly or P version of creation. And the P writer, unlike the J writer who will follow him, imagines creation as a stately progression. Everything is harmonious, everything is choreographed. And that beautiful cadence, the great light for dominion of day and the small light for dominion of night and the stars, is a subliminal way of conveying to the audience the sense that all is in its harmonious place. So I think it looks like something that might be a little fussy at first thought, but I think it is meaningful. Okay, then we have the matter of syntax. Now, as probably most of you in this Zoom know, biblical syntax in the narrative prose is noteworthy for its use of series of clauses attached to each other by and. It's what scholars call parataxis, which means parallel syntax. In other words, you don't have which, that, despite, while, and so forth, that you have and this and that. And you heard a little of this in the long passage from the flood story that I read. I think that this structure has its eloquence, which can still speak to readers in the 21st century. What the moderns have done is to repackage the syntax entirely, to make it sound like what they conceive to be modern English. The result often is to make passages of the Bible sound like the daily newspaper or as if they were written yesterday, which I think is a mistake. Because when I translated the Bible, I didn't want it to be prissily archaic, but I wanted to give it a certain antique coloration to convey the sense that this was written a long time ago. And I should add this, that parataxis, this kind of syntax, became available for literary English after the King James Version, which is highly paratactic, following the Hebrew. And so it certainly can work in modern literary English. Okay, otherwise, there are many inversions of syntax to expressive purpose. And I'll give you one brief one. When the sons of Jacob returned from their first journey to Egypt, they tell their old father that Simeon has been held hostage in Egypt, and the man who rules over all of Egypt, of course they don't yet know that it's their brother Joseph, will not see their faces again unless they bring down Benjamin, who is the most beloved of Jacob's sons after the disappearance of his brother Joseph. So how does he respond? He says in my translation, "Me you have bereaved. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and Benjamin you would take. On me is all the burden." Well, some people might say, that's not the way we do things in English. We don't say, "Me who you have bereaved." We say, "You have bereaved me." Or more formally, "It is I that you have bereaved." But the Hebrew has a little shocking effect, because the standard way to say "you have bereaved me" in biblical Hebrew is to take the verb that means to bereave and to tack onto it a little suffix that means both me and you in the plural. Biblical Hebrew is very, very compact, I have to say. So it would be one word in biblical Hebrew, shikaltuni, but that is not what the writer does. Instead, he takes the word that means me and sticks it at the beginning of Jacob's speech. Oti shikaltem, me you have bereaved. I think there's a point in that, which is that ever since the presumed death of Joseph, Jacob has become a kind of prima donna of paternal grief. And you can see this here. He puts himself, me, you have bereaved. And then the rest of the sentence also makes him prominent. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and Benjamin you would take. On me is all the burden. Alai hayu kulana in the Hebrew. Also, if you still feel a little finicky about the strangeness of me you would have bereaved, this kind of syntactic inversion was once very common in English, not so far back, a century and a half, 2 centuries, and was especially used in poetry. For example, the opening line of Keats's famous sonnet on first looking into Chapman's Homer, much have I traveled in the realms of gold. Now, that's not the normal word order. Normally, you would say, I have traveled much in the realms of gold. But Keats wanted to put much at the very head of the sentence. And I think the fact that this sounds a little bit old-fashioned, as I say, not outrageously archaic, but reminiscent of a somewhat earlier period in English literature, helps reinforce the sense that this is an old text, that this is a text that was written many centuries ago. Okay, now I want to add one thing, since I've been highlighting, as I will again, the attempt to recreate in English literary features of the Hebrew. I also cared a lot about the meaning of words, the precise meaning of words. And I think that the modern scholars, whom I used to think were totally authoritative, make mistakes about this. So I will give you 3 or 4 examples. They all have to do with single words. In the Samson story, the wager, you may remember, between Samson and the Philistine wedding guests is that if they solve his riddle, he will give each of them, and there are 30 of them, a chalifat begadim. And chalifat begadim clearly means a change of garments, that is, a new garment. But when Samson, outraged, goes down to the city of Ashkelon, a Philistine city, and kills 30 Philistines, he brings back their chalitzot, not chalifot with an F sound, but chalitzot with a ts sound. Well, everybody assumes that this must be another word for, because it's an unusual word. It only appears one other place in the Bible as something you wear. This is an unusual word for garment. So they translate it as garment or cloak or robe or tunic, all of which are mistaken. How do I know what they're mistaken? Well, the one other place in the Bible where chalitza appears is during the civil war between the house of David and the house of Saul after Saul's death. the general of Saul's forces is being pursued by a fleet-footed young man named Asael. And he doesn't want to kill him because that's going to make bad blood between him and Asael's brothers, who were ruthless killers, by the way. So he says, turn you to the right or to the left and strike down one of the lads and take his chalitza. Now, what does a warrior on the battlefield take from a slain enemy? He doesn't take his tunic. He doesn't take his cloak. He takes his armor. And in fact, the root of this word is connected with chalutz, which in biblical Hebrew means military vanguard. So I am convinced that the chalitza was the armor worn by the elite fighters in the chalutz, in the vanguard. So what light does this throw on the Samson story? The bet had been for a change of garments. Instead of that, Samson brings back to the Philistines something far more valuable, 30 sets of armor. Not only that, but it conveys a warning to the Philistines because they know that only warriors would have worn that armor. So he didn't kill any old Philistines, he killed 30 Philistine warriors. So you see how certain things come into focus if you get just one word right. Okay, I'm going to skip a couple of examples and just take two more single words. In the story of the rape of Tamar by her half-brother Amnon, there's a word that clearly means food or some kind of food, birya. Now, there are two perfectly normal, prevalent words in biblical Hebrew for food, ochel, meaning food, and lechem, meaning bread, but as a synecdoche for food in general. But that is not the word that the writer chooses in this story. He chooses birya and repeats it 6 or 7 times, and it's very rare elsewhere in the Bible. So what's going on? I checked my trusty guide to understanding biblical Hebrew is the Hebrew Concordance. And I find that in every instance in which briya is used, it's for somebody who has been fasting or somebody who has been doing poorly. Now, Amnon has been persuaded by a friend of his to pretend that he's ill so he can lure the beautiful Tamar, his half-sister, into his bedchamber. And that's the relevance of a word that means giving food that you give to somebody who's been doing poorly. So I couldn't get it 100% right, but I decided instead of just saying food, I would say nourishment. I couldn't say chicken soup because the chicken had not yet been domesticated, but you get the idea. Okay, two more examples having to do with precision. Well, I'll just I'll slice one of these examples in half to be efficient with time. When God says he's in Exodus that he's about to appear to Israel, he says, I'm about to appear in Av Ha'anan. Now, all the translations say something like a thick cloud. But that's not right, because the word for thick is aveh, with the Hebrew letter hey at the end. And they all get it wrong. The word here is av, and av with an ayin, not the aleph, which means father. The av is another word, a poetic word for cloud. So it's sort of like, I'm about to appear before you in the thunder bolt the thunderhead of the cloud. Well, what's that all about? I've detected a pattern in biblical Hebrew when you have two words that are joined together in what's called the construct state, like the house of David. When those two words are synonyms, they convey some kind of extreme heightening. So this is not an ordinary cloud, it's a kind of super cloud. It's a mythic cloud. And so I translated, I'm about to appear before you in the utmost cloud, which gives a kind of grandeur, a kind of heightening to the sentence that you don't have when you erroneously translate as thick cloud. Okay, one last thing having to do with a single word. When Abraham, at the behest of his wife, drives Hagar out into the wilderness, which is basically the Sinai desert, the water skin runs out of water, and they're under the blazing southern sun, and she's convinced that her only child, will die within minutes. So what does she do? And here's the Hebrew verb, vatashlech, and vatashlichenu it is, and I won't translate it yet, she does something to her son under one of the bushes. Now, if you look at the translations, the one that comes closest, but it doesn't go far enough, is the King James Version, which says, she thrust him under one of the bushes. The modern translation says she lay him under one of the bushes, she put him under one of the bushes, she placed him under one of the bushes, all of which betray the Hebrew. Because this verb, hashlich, means one thing and one thing only whenever it appears. It's to fling. It's the very verb that Pharaoh uses when he says, every male child you shall fling into the Nile. So what I think the writer is telling us is that Hagar, convinced that she's about to lose her only beloved son, in a kind of paroxysm of maternal grief, flings him down and runs away. So you get something of the psychology of the mother in desperate straits. And this is a bold move on the part of the writer, and the translators have not followed the boldness of the original. Okay, I'm going to, I should leave adequate time for your questions. So I won't do all the paths, but I really haven't touched on poetry at all. And I would like to, I'm not going to read the whole psalm, but I'm going to look at Psalm 30. It's a Thanksgiving psalm. That is, the speaker has been saved by God from near death, presumably some terrible illness. and in the midst of this Thanksgiving psalm, he recalls the prayer to God to save him that he issued in his desperate straits when he was running 105 fever and everybody thought he was a goner. Now, the King James Version, this is, I'm reading just 2 lines here, says, what profit in my blood, says, what profit is there in my blood, in my going down, when I go down to the pit in the King James Version? Will dust acclaim you? Will it tell your truth? Now, the second line is quite okay, and is okay in all the translations. But if you listen to the first half of the previous line, what profit is there in my blood? Now, that is arrhythmic. What profit is there in my blood? It doesn't sound like a line of poetry. I should say, parenthetically, that the moderns represent blood as death because they don't think modern readers can understand a metaphor. And that's another mistake. So I looked at the King James Version, which is pretty much followed by all the moderns. And I noticed that is there is italicized. In the 17th century, it was a different kind of font, but the italics don't indicate emphasis. What they indicate is words that are supplied that are not explicitly in the Hebrew. And it suddenly dawned on me that you don't need them. The Hebrew, the first half of the line is like this: Ma betza bidami, a pounding rhythm. If you leave out the is there, you get what profit in my blood, the same rhythm exactly. And it's an expressive rhythm. So I would say this, that I won't have time to go on at length about translating poetry, but I would say this: biblical poetry is very compact. There are not many polysyllabic words. You can often say in biblical Hebrew in 3 words what it takes 7 or 8 words to do in English. And my task as a translator, I didn't always meet the challenge fully, but I tried, was to tamp down English, to use brief words. As you can hear, there's only 1 word in my translation of this line that's more than 1 syllable, and to get rid of anything that seemed extraneous, that wasn't strictly necessary, like not happy is the man, but simply happy the man, and so forth. Now, I'd like to, while I'm on, I guess I should wind up in about 5 minutes. But while I'm on Psalm 30, something else that has to do with the sound of poetry. At the end of the poem, the speaker thanks God for transforming his life from misery to joy. And he says, I'm going to do this very literally first, you have turned my chant of mourning to a dance for me. Now, the Hebrew sounds like this: Hafachta mispedi lemachol li. So you can hear the alliteration between the word for mourning, misped, and the word for dance, machol. They both begin with the consonant mem. And I realized that this is important for the poet because the sound shows that God's great power can take something very negative, something very grim, and flip it 180 degrees to something that is opposite, that also begins with the same consonant. I hope you follow that. So all of a sudden I got lucky. I realized that there is a perfectly good monosyllabic word in English for a chant of mourning that begins with D. You have turned my dirge to a dance for me. So that made me very happy because I felt I really had created an equivalent for the Hebrew. Okay, I think I'd like to do just one last thing. I've run on a little longer than I meant to, and that is say something about dialogue. I came to realize something I hadn't realized when I wrote that book on biblical narrative all those years ago, that the true precursor of dialogue in narrative, a dialogue in the novel, is biblical dialogue. Now, in Homer, you have great speeches, but they're speeches that run on sometimes for hundreds of lines. Whereas in the Bible, you have a kind of give and take between the two speakers, with the words indicating the position, sometimes the social class, the mentality of each of the speakers. Abraham has passed off Sarah as his wife. This is Genesis 20. And and God has appeared to Abimelech, the king, in a night vision and told him that this is a married woman, keep your hands off her. So Abimelech is outraged. And Abimelech called to Abraham and said to him, what have you done to us? And how have I offended you that you should bring upon me and my kingdom so great an offense? Things that should not be done, you have done to me. And Abimelech said to Abraham, what did you imagine when you did this thing? Now you notice that the normal pattern of dialogue in the Bible is X says to Y, and then you have his words, and then Y answered and says to X, and then you have Y's words. But there are quite a few instances where an X said to Y, X's speech, and then again the introduction of the formula for speech, and X said to Y. Well, I think in all those instances, the repetition of the introductory formula for dialogue is an indication that the interlocutor has a problem about answering. Either he's embarrassed or he's baffled or he's amazed or whatever. And I think that's the case with Abraham. That is, Abraham doesn't know how to answer, and then he figures something out. And Abraham said, for I thought there is surely no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. And in point of fact, she is my sister, my father's daughter, though not my mother's daughter, and she became my wife. There have been many explanations, and I think it's kind of a smokescreen. And therefore, the unusual term omna, I translated as in point of fact, taking it as a kind of legalism. He's trying to wiggle out of it. But I just want to read one more sentence, and I will cease and desist. And it happened, Abraham is still speaking, when the gods made me a wanderer from my father's house, that I told her, this is the kindness you can do for me. In every place to which we come, save me, he is my brother. Now, I'm almost positive that I'm the very first translator to say the gods here. Everybody says God. The word is Elohim, which in almost all of its usages means God. But, and it's, even though it has a plural ending, im is a plural ending, it's in all those cases treated as a, grammatically as a singular noun, but not here. Not here and in 2 or 3 other places in the biblical corpus. Here, it is unambiguously treated as a plural. That is, for those of you who know Hebrew, the verb is like, Vayihi ka'asher hit'u oti Elohim. Hit'u is the plural form of the verb that means to make wander. Whenever it's treated as a plural, it does not mean God, it means the gods. And that's how it's used when, in the story of the golden calf, Aaron says, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt." So what is the first monotheist doing talking about the gods? I think it's a wonderful example of the pungency of biblical narrative. That is, Abraham is talking to a polytheist. He doesn't want to confuse him. He wants to talk to him in his own lingo. So he says, he doesn't want to say, God made me a wanderer. He says, the gods made me a wanderer. And it could even be a kind of convention of speech. Doesn't mean really anything theological, but when my fate, my destiny, my circumstances made me a wanderer, etc. So I could go on a long time about biblical dialogue, but this little bit of it, I hope, gives you some sense of its liveliness, how much more interesting it is than we typically imagine. I haven't done everything right in my translation. All translations are imperfect, but I've made a sustained effort to come closer to the complexity, the subtlety, and the vigor of the Hebrew. Thank you. I'm prepared to field your questions as they're curated.
So we have questions should be put in the chat. I have several already. And the first one is, although the motivation for taking on this remarkable and audacious task was not primarily theological in nature, as you said earlier, your translation certainly has religious implications for some readers. And linguistic choices aside, what religious criticisms have you received from theologians and clergy about your translation? I'll just add, if any. And did your work have an impact on your personal beliefs or worldview?
I'll answer the second question briefly first. No, because it made me realize in greater depth what a rich body of stories and poems we have in the Bible. But since my motivation was in a way literary, it didn't affect anything having to do with my belief. But here is a surprising thing that happened. I am not aware of criticism from a theological angle by religious figures. No doubt, since there have been many, many responses to my translation, there may have been a few such that I missed, but I haven't seen any. But here was the big surprise for me. I didn't have a clear sense of audience when I set out to do this translation. And over the time, it's slowed down now. I've gotten scores and scores of responses from readers by email. And a large majority of them are from religious people. And religious people of all different stripes. That is modern Orthodox Jews, conservative Jews, but figures like Presbyterian organists, Baptist ministers, an Episcopalian nun, and so on and so forth. And that took me aback. I didn't really expect that. But what I came to realize is that there are many religious people, very seriously religious people, who had a kind of hunger to have an English version of the Bible that would bring them closer to what the original was like, that would feed into their religious experience. I mean, one particular response that amazed me, a few years ago, this Episcopalian nun wrote me that my translation of Psalms had changed her spiritual regimen.
Okay, thank you. Another question along the same lines, I think. Your translation of several of this person's favorite biblical passages, Kohelet, Akedah, Job, Psalm 23, has deepened this questioner's understanding of them and connection to them. And the question is there a particular passage or story that you translated that surprised you as you worked on it, or profoundly changed your take on that passage?
Well, profoundly might be too strong word, but let me take the 23rd Psalm, which usually in the King James Version is something that many English readers know at least partly, perhaps even entirely by heart. There was one obvious thing to begin with, and this is consistent throughout my translation: thou restoreth my soul. Now, there is no biblical word for soul. Nefesh, there's no concept of a soul in the Bible, of a soul distinct from the body. So nefesh means life breath or life. So I think I rendered that as you bring back my life. But then we get to the crucial midpoint in the 23rd Psalm. Thou anointest my head with oil. Well, all the modern translations follow that. You know, they don't use the archaic verb ending, but they say, you anointed my head with oil. That is wrong. Why is it wrong? Because there's only one word, one verb in biblical Hebrew that means to anoint, and that's mashach, cognate with Mashiach, Messiah. And it occurs in two contexts, that verb. The anointing of a king, which is equivalent to crowning the king, and the consecration of the high priest, okay? And that is not the verb that's used. The verb that's used is dashen, dishanta bashemen roshi. Now, dashen means something like to make luxuriant, even to fertilize. So it has nothing to do with consecration of priests or with consecration of kings. It's not political and it's not theological. It has to do with the good life here and now. That is one of the things you do to enjoy this good life, is you rub your head with good virgin olive oil. So that threw a new perspective on the whole 23rd Psalm for me, that it's about enjoying God's presence here and now with the body that has given me to live this physical life. And that all turned on the realization of the right translation for a single word.
Froma, do you want to unmute? And
Pardon me?
Froma, unmute.
It's me, or if someone's all the way. What I was very taken by, not so much the translation, but the work that went into the notes. Those notes speak to such a depth of research, and that takes it into a completely different level. So maybe you'd like to talk about what you did in terms of deciding that these belong in the translation.
Okay. I originally didn't intend to do something like a commentary, and I ended up doing that.
Right.
There were a lot of things I wanted to say, and then other things that just needed to be said. I did a lot of reading, obviously modern biblical scholarship, which at times was helpful. Also, especially medieval Hebrew commentaries, my two favorite being Rashi and Avraham Ibn Ezra, both of whom were acute readers with a fine sensitivity to the nuances of Hebrew words, who often gave me clues for things. But then also, this is not to sound egotistical, but many of the ideas that get into the notes were my own ideas, not the fruit of research. And that's for a simple reason. As I've been trying to explain over the last hour, the literary shaping of these texts is extremely important. And I found that as a literary scholar, there were many features of the narrative prose, of the shifting from narration to dialogue, of the shaping of the poetry, that the existing commentaries did not deal with, because they don't deal with such things. And so I wanted to talk about those. And those, I think, are by and large my own perceptions.
But that follows on to those two early books about Hebrew in the Bible that you did.
Pardon me?
That follows on to the two very much earlier books that you did on the literary aspects of the Bible.
Yeah, of course, the early books. That's right. That first got me attuned to all this. And then by happenstance, I got into translating. First, I thought I would just do Genesis as a kind of experiment that was doomed to fail. And then it worked better than I thought. And I went on from one book to the other, and there it was.
Apparently, when you get started, there's no end to it. And someone just put a question in the chat asking, now that you've completed the translations of the entire Hebrew Bible, are there any changes you would go back to make from the earlier work?
Well, I teach a course in literary translation at Berkeley, and I tell my students that all translations, including the published ones, are works in progress. So if I have to say this, that when I put the whole thing together, of course, I had to carefully go over the volumes that had already been published. And from time to time, I would find something that I wanted to change. And I suppose I'm not going to do this, but if I were going to go over the whole thing again, verse by verse, I would probably here and there find other things that I would want to change. that's the works in progress aspect of it. But I found that those changes were rather limited. So it's readers, for better or worse, can take it that this is the way I wanted to translate the Bible.
And a wonderful translation it is. And another question. For those among us who are not sufficiently literate in Hebrew, how might we begin to enter even more deeply into this wonderful discussion? Is it ever too late to learn the biblical and modern Hebrew?
Well, I would put the modern Hebrew aside. If your chief interest is the Bible, that is, modern Hebrew has a vastly larger vocabulary than biblical Hebrew. I think you have to be motivated, but the poetry is a special challenge because it does have a richer vocabulary and other kinds of complexities. The narrative prose works with a deliberately limited vocabulary, as we saw in that passage from the flood story. The flood was over the earth. The ark went on the face of the water. So I would say in a couple of years of study, you could acquire enough of biblical Hebrew to make your way through a lot of the narrative.
Thank you. I have an idea who wrote that question, and I think she was pointedly addressing it so that to encourage me to learn biblical Hebrew. What I do is I look at multiple translations when I am in doubt as to the meaning of something, and yours comes out on top. And it did today. We were studying a Talmudic portion about mourning, and there's a rule that one cannot excessively mourn, and it's based on Jeremiah 22:10. And your translation departs significantly from all of the others, and in a way that opened my eyes to its meaning. You use the word keen. Do not keen for the dead,
Right.
and do not grieve for him. Keen constantly for him. The repetition of the word keen, which is not a common word in our daily discourse, but is just the perfect word in this situation. And where every other translation talks about how the one who departs shall return no more, you say he will not come back. And the definite, simple statement is exactly right. And I'm just really, in awe of you.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I was happy with using keen.
So we have some other questions here. Someone is asking, in honor your father and your mother, what does honor mean? Is it a feeling, a mindset, or a specific behavior?
I think it's before all else a behavior. That is, you treat your mother and father with respect.
Another question. If I say in 2022, that is today, if I say this table weighs a ton, and you read it 2,500 or 3,500 years from now, how do you know I mean the table is heavy, or that the table, or do I mean that the table truly weighs a ton?
Well, I think common sense and a little historical investigation would tell you that it's figurative. That is, if 5 centuries from now, the ton is no longer used as a unit of weight, there will be scholars that will say it's the equivalent in our system too, and then it will give the equivalent, and you will realize that a ton is far more than a table could weigh, and therefore it's a hyperbole.
Thank you. Very good. Well, I think this question is an inevitable question coming in a conservative synagogue. Can you discuss why you decided to translate words referring to Adonai Elohim using male pronouns?
Yeah, because I wanted to be faithful to the original. That is, we are all very gender advanced these days, and we know it's a category mistake to think of God as being male. But in the Hebrew of the Bible, he is unambiguously male, and he's a he. That is, it's he, the pronoun hu, which is attached to God. All the verbs are attached to God are conjugated in the masculine, because you have gender conjugation in Hebrew. And in the early part of the Bible, in Genesis, which is highly anthropomorphic, God appears, for example, before Abraham sitting at his tent flap in Genesis 18, and he looks like a man who's a wayfarer. He doesn't look like a hermaphrodite or a woman or someone whose gender can't be determined. He looks like a man. So I think we have to be honest with what's going on in the original and not reshape it to reflect our own values or ideology.
Our interlocutor has a follow-up question, and it will be our last question, which is, why not just use the Hebrew for God?
Oh, the Hebrew
Avoid the gender issue.
names of God.
Yeah.
The names of God are a tricky issue, and I wrestle with this a little. I think rendering Elohim, which I dwelt on a few minutes ago, as God is certainly okay, because that's what it means in biblical Hebrew. You're not shifting the ground in any way. So the real challenge is, what do you do about the tetragrammaton, that is Yahweh? As scholars think, I'm a little skeptical, they think that it was pronounced that way in ancient times. Now, I didn't want to represent it as Yahweh, because there is, in my view, a certain margin of uncertainty as to whether it was actually pronounced that way. Second, it would give offense to certain Jewish readers who, it's the Shem HaMeforash, the name that only the high priest in the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur is supposed to pronounce. Thirdly, it sounds a little like something that would belong in a scholarly article, say in the JBL, the Journal of Biblical Literature, rather than in the Bible itself. So there's one alternative, which many have opted for, is to, in capital letters, to represent this as YHWH. The problem with that is you can't pronounce it. You lose the rhythm of the sentence, the readability of the sentence. So I decided to follow the King James Version in two ways. I represent it as the Lord, and you notice that there's something funny about the typography of that word in the King James Version. It's all in uppercase letters with a larger font for the L and a smaller font for the ORD, which is a way of indicating that this is not exactly what the Hebrew is. And that follows the fact that we say Adonai, even though it isn't written Aleph, Daled, Nun, Yud, but rather Yud, He, Vav, He. So it was a compromise, but I think it contributed to the literary readability of the English version.
Thank you, Professor Alter. Thank you for your talk and your thoughtful answers to our questions.
I'm Freddie Perlmutter, and I'm co-chair of the Adult Education Committee. On behalf of the Adult Education Committee, I would like to thank Professor Alter for a very enlightening program. I would also like to thank our Zoom master, Frank Lees, and our question curator, Neil Litt, for helping to make this a successful program. Here are the Adult Education Committee's programs for the rest of the year. Our sole program for April will take place this coming Tuesday at 8 p.m. on Zoom. Images of Hagar with Dr. Deborah Miller, the former Associate Director of the Melton Research Center for Jewish Education at JTS, will explore the topic of biblical women through artist's eyes with this case study. The Adult Education Committee will be presenting a special program in honor of the installation of Rabbi Andrea Merrow. Rabbi Dr. Gordon Tucker, the Vice Chancellor of JTS, will speak on Rethinking Genesis 1. Are we as exceptional as we think we are? Rabbi Tucker will be speaking in person here at the Temple on Tuesday, May 10th at 7:30 p.m. Our final program of the year will also be the final TJ Sego's Global program for this highly successful inaugural cycle. We will learn about the Jewish community of Uganda. Dr. David Breakstone, the former vice chairman of the Jewish Agency for Israel, will be coming to us from Jerusalem via Zoom on Sunday, May 15th at 1:30 p.m. Thank you and good night.